Moving on to our next unit, we're going to study genre. I'm going to start by giving you a definition of genre, and then I want to discuss the 4 different kinds of genre, one which we rarely see today, and the other 3 which we see all the time. We call a group of plays which have a similar point of view different genres. Genre is not based on subject matter, but how the artists are handling that subject matter. If you were taking, say, a music appreciation class, you would have different musical genre: classical, jazz, rock, etc. Okay, so back to the subject matter. You can have the same subject matter, but it's how the artists see it, their point of view. Do they find it funny? Or do they find it serious? Do they find it sad? That is what creates a drama genre or a comedy genre, etc. In other words, you can have 2 films that have a similar or the same subject matter, but they could be different genre. I have here the example of 2 zombie movies: World War Z, which is very serious, and Shaun of the Dead, which is a comedy. Same subject matter, but the artists see it in a different way, and that point of view is what gives something its genre. So there's 4 kinds of theatrical genre that I want to cover. Yes, there's subgenre. In fact, in melodrama, there's lots of different kinds of melodramas. What we would call scary movies, scary plays, what are murder mysteries, etc. Those are all different kinds of subgenre of melodrama. But the 4 that I want to focus on are the 4 that are the most produced. And we're starting with the only genre that's not being actively written and performed in the same context as it was in the past. Tragedy, I like to call it traditional tragedy to separate it from the use of the word tragedy that we often hear used today in reference to very serious plays. Traditional tragedy, or tragedy with a capital T, is a very specific historical genre. I'm going to go into a lot more detail about that. So I mentioned that there's a genre tragedy that we don't do today. There's only 3 times in history when these plays were being written and performed. Greek theater, Elizabethan theater, which is Shakespeare's theater, and 17th century neoclassical theater, which is a time period where the playwrights were trying to replicate Greek theater and what the Greeks were doing. Now, tragedies have very specific characteristics that the audiences of these 3 time periods appreciated and looked for in a tragedy. That's what binds them all together. Today's audiences are very diverse. We all have very different opinions about what is art, what we expect in a play. We're not as cohesive when it comes to viewing and our expectations of genre as were the Greeks, Elizabethans, and neoclassical viewers. So that's one of the reasons I'm going to spend some time going over what are those characteristics of the traditional tragedy that the audiences were looking for. So here we go. Characteristics of the traditional tragedy. Tragedies always have a tragic hero. All of these plays have a very specific kind of protagonist. We label him the tragic hero, not just a hero, because today our heroes are often anti-heroes. They do good things, but they're not necessarily all the way around good people. We have anti-heroes. Again, this is not the kind of hero that tragedies have. There's no anti-hero. These people have very specific characteristics. They're always of noble birth. They're king, queen, aristocracy. Again, they're really good people. They're not bad people who just happen to do good things. They are good and noble. They have a moral compass. They believe in a higher power. They often make decisions based on this belief in God and morality. They have what's called a tragic flaw. This is something about their personality which brings about their downfall, but it is not something that in a normal sense would be a bad thing. For example, Oedipus' tragic flaw is his hubris, that he thinks he can fix things even though the gods have said that he can't. But isn't that a quality that's good in a king? To be proactive, to want to fix things. It is noble to often have these tragic flaws. Again, Oedipus is the perfect example of a tragic hero. He is of noble birth. And tragic heroes always suffer. Nothing goes their way. They can't fix anything. Oedipus believes, he prays to Apollo to help him. He believes in a higher power, yet he is unable to fix anything that's happening to him. And mostly that is because in tragedies, it is very late in the story that the plot starts. All the things that bring about Oedipus's death, his decline, all the horrible things that happen to him have actually happened before our play starts. It is all part of the backstory, the exposition. And that's what's fascinating about Greek tragedies. They understood building of anticipation and building of suspense by letting the audience know information, and the audience realizes, oh my God, he has already killed his father and married his mother. He can't fix this, and this isn't his fault. He's a good guy who's trapped in a horrible situation. So this very specific, noble, tragic hero is key. It's the first key to characteristics of the tragedies. Moving on to the other characteristics, all of these plays use poetic language. The playwrights write in, Shakespeare wrote in iambic pentameter. You've read Oedipus, so you see the poetic language that's being used there. Alexandrian verse was the poetic device that was used by neoclassical playwrights. The belief is that by using poetic dialogue, it separates these characters from the common man. They speak differently, they live a different kind of heightened sense of life and importance. They don't even speak the way we do. Also, tragic circumstances. People are in bad situations in these plays. Really bad things happen in these plays. It's not enough that Oedipus has killed his father. Oh no, he has married and had children with his mother. There's always a double whammy of really bad things. And of course, they're out of the protagonist's control, and things never end up well. We're not talking about tragedy as we use the word tragedy, a tragic accident, a tragic death. Like, again, we're talking about things that are really bad and a really big deal. A couple other characteristics. This idea of irretrievability, like I mentioned. The characters are always in circumstances they can't fix, they can't get out of. These are plays with no happy endings. And the reason for all of these characteristics is that the audience was supposed to achieve what they called catharsis. Now, we use the word catharsis today. Usually it is for, it's to mean an emotional purging. But they meant something much bigger than that. The reason for all these characteristics is this effect of catharsis, which I'm going to define in the next slide. Okay, so the playwrights of tragedies, like I said, they were going for this catharsis. What they wanted was an emotional, intellectual response from their audience that would be transformative. The audiences were to see these plays and have a religious experience. It would change their lives. Now, I want to discuss briefly why we don't have this today. I mentioned earlier that our audiences, we're all so diverse. We have different religions, different backgrounds, different ideas. The people who went to see these plays were much more alike than they were different from one another. For example, the only people who saw Greek plays were land-owning Greek men. They had the same lifestyle, the same religion, so they would respond in a similar way. So you could do a play that fit all of these specific characteristics and would bring about this transformative life experience. The idea behind a play like Oedipus is, see, if you screw around with the gods, this is what's going to happen. There is such a thing as fate. They're teaching as they're showing this play. You don't want to be like Oedipus. See what happened to him? See what happened to him eventually because there was a disbelief in fate and the gods. Okay, so moving on to the serious genre that we call drama. When we think of serious plays that are about serious material, that's what we call a drama. Historically, over the last couple of millennia, and there were basically two types of drama. Heroic drama, which began and overlapped with tragedies. These are older plays. The characters are usually kings, queens, again, of noble birth. And they're bad, serious circumstances. In fact, you might start reading a heroic drama and think, well, this is going to be a tragedy. But the ending is not as bad as tragedies. In fact, some of the issues are resolved. It can end up almost kind of happy-ish. Domestic dramas are more modern plays. These are plays that were about the middle class, common people, the things that are part of our life that causes drama. Okay, so the overall characteristics of drama is that they are serious plays. They're not as specific in characteristics as tragedies. Today, you will often see a mix of serious with the comic and vice versa. For many, many years, that was not allowed. And any play that even hinted at having a comedic moment in it was regarded as a bad play and sometimes shut down. But today, we're very used to comic relief moments in drama. And again, we have comedies that have some serious intent and themes. They usually end up with the protagonist winning or gaining something at the end, even though most of our time watching a drama is spent watching serious content. So what genre do we see the most of? Well, that would be melodrama, because we do watch so much television. And melodrama in theater is usually along the lines of murder mysteries, thrillers, romantic plays about affairs, etc. It's kind of formulaic. There's highs, there's lows. Melodramas are about taking the audience kind of on a roller coaster ride of emotions. Here are the characteristics. It's usually pretty clear, good versus evil. Westerns, great example of melodrama. Melodrama speaks to the paranoia in all of us. In other words, we don't want to be in the situation that the main characters are in because it is uncomfortable and makes us feel bad. Melodramas will always focus over storytelling, over logic and reality. It's the kind of thing that when you look back on it, you realize, okay, yeah, that's not really going to happen. Science fiction, Star Wars, all of those things are clearly melodramas. The characters are pretty simple. We know just enough about them to appreciate their choices that they're making within the play. However, we don't know nor do they tell their most deep thoughts and feelings. And melodramas always end up happy. People will die along the way, but basically the world is saved. Everything is okay. So moving on to comedy. I believe that comedy is the hardest of all genre because in order to be successful with a comedy, you have to have an understanding of what makes people laugh. And what makes me laugh is not always the same thing that makes you laugh or your parents or my husband. We all laugh often at very different things. So that automatically makes comedy much more difficult. You can call something a comedy that's basically working with a humorous point of view. All comedies have what's called a comic premise. It's an underlying notion, situation, or idea which makes everything funny. Why is a film like Blades of Glory supposed to be funny? Well, instead of a man and a woman in figure skating, it's two men as figure skating. That's the underlying comic premise. You can break comedy up into basically three forms. Anything that's designed to make an audience respond in a humorous way can be called a comedy. When you're looking at a play, you look at where is that comedy coming from, what is the audience actually laughing at, and then you can divide that comedy into levels, and those levels are based from farce to satire. Farce is any comedy that relies on the physical for laughs. If you're laughing at people falling down, funny walks, I think most of the funny cat videos that we all watch, we're watching because it's farce. Satire is comedy that relies more on the intellectual. If you're watching things like The Daily Show, Saturday Night Live newscasts, anything that's political or cultural, and that's where the humor is coming from, then you're watching satirical humor. We divide comedy into 6 levels. Again, when I'm getting ready to do a comedy, I pay particular attention to what level I think the majority of the humor is coming from so that I can be consistent throughout that play. The lowest level of comedy is comedy of obscenity, comedy that relies on obscenity, shock value. A lot of stand-up comedians rely on low comedy. Anything, if you watch the show Jackass, that's definitely low comedy. Basically, if you're laughing at people getting hurt, you're watching the lowest form of comedy. Comedy that's reliant on physical, but is not just about shock and obscenity, it's also considered a lower form of comedy, but in the right hands, it can be brilliant. It is a more sophisticated form of low comedy that relies on physical mishap for the laughs. If you're looking at someone like Charlie Chaplin, those silent film stars, a lot of what Jim Carrey does is physical comedy. Situational comedy is where the humor comes from a funny situation that the characters find them in. And so we're laughing along as they struggle and work out this really weird, funny situation. This is where we get situation comedies on television. Our last levels of comedy are comedy based on character. This is where you see an oddball, weird character, and everyone else around that character is responding to their weirdness. And that's where the laughs come from. Wordplay, the fifth level of comedy, the humor is about puns and misspoken language and things like that. If you've seen the substitute teacher Key and Peele video that went viral, that's a great example of wordplay, that we're laughing at someone who's mistakenly pronouncing names. The sixth level, and again the highest level, is satirical, where the humor is coming from cultural or political nature. Humor that is coming from politics or something in our culture. The sixth level of comedy is the kind of thing where if you're not part of our culture, Americans, you're not in on the joke and you won't find it funny.